This is a presentation of the WELS Historical Institute and Friends of the Salem Landmark Church. Welcome to the 2011 Summer Series of Great Leaders of the Past, showing God's grace in the history of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. Featuring Pastor John Brenner, who led his Wisconsin Synod through difficult financial and fellowship struggles during 62 years of public ministry. With historical background and insights by Dr. Mark E. Braun, Professor of Theology at Wisconsin Lutheran College in Milwaukee. Presented in the Salem Landmark Church, birthplace of the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod in 1850, currently being restored to its original likeness.
Thank you, Dan. That was a very kind introduction. Sometimes I tell my classes at the end of the semester, of all the classes I've ever had, you're one of them. And they wait for something really wonderful, and they don't hear much. I debated with myself, should I wear a tie and look dressed up? But you know, today's homecoming for the college, and I want to go to the football game and not look like a Mormon missionary. So I thought, well, this is a good halfway choice. And as it turns out, I hope this will connect, okay with the sweaters. Today is, for me, it's a bit of a milestone. Today is the last day that I'm still in my 50s. And I'm saying that not to brag or not to whine, but I have some colleagues and friends who, of course, are in the same age range, 59, turning 60. And we all remark to each other how we're starting to feel our age. Get a little slower, a little harder to get up, memory begins to slip. And then I think President Brenner was elected president of the Synod when he was 59. And he served until he was 79 as president. He was a pastor for 62 years. He was pastor at St. John's downtown for 50 years. And even at that, at the age of 84, when he retired, he did not exactly go quietly. He in the four or so years remaining that he was alive and living with his son, he would remark how it hurt him to give away his ministry. And some of the old-time members who still have a connection there say that they kind of had to persuade him to retire because they were afraid he would fall backwards out of the pulpit while he was preaching and break his neck. And if you'd ever seen that church, that's a reality that you'd have to reckon with. And what's especially of interest is in his age is that I saved the obituary that Professor Kowalski at Northwestern wrote about him. It's a wide-ranging. We don't do obituaries like this in our publications. One of the things he says was, he was not naturally robust and did not always enjoy the good health that his energy and endurance seemed to indicate. He might begin a day feeling somewhat less than fit for the work at hand, but he seemed to grow stronger as the session dragged on into the night and towards midnight. Nothing escaped him when he was in the chair, with one exception. If the assignment committee happened to meet in the morning after an especially trying midnight session, he was inclined to sit back, light his pipe, and let the district presidents take over. So, and as I did some research on Pastor Brenner, half the people I talked to who remembered him were retired already. And they were way younger than he was when he was Synod president. So, the natural thing to think is people were different then. I think he didn't have any retirement plan. In fact, those who knew his family said that he never took any vacations. And he had no interest in sports at all. Today would be just another day for him, even though there's so much going on for us. But when he felt, he would say that when he was really getting tired, he would experience what he called a brain fag, and he would paint a room in the parsonage as recreation. I have the biography here, and I think it largely speaks for itself. And that is the picture that was probably the famous picture of him that's always shown. Now his son, John F. Brenner, was pastor mostly in Bay City, Michigan, and I believe he's still alive. He would be about 93 now. I think he's in a nursing home in Saginaw. And then John F.'s son is John M. Brenner, who's at the seminary. He's the professor of church history at the seminary, and of course bears the same name and is concerned about the history. He's named his son Nathaniel, so I think the John Brenner moniker is at least retired for a while. One thing I would mention of note up on his biography is that he gave the graduation oration in English when he graduated from Northwestern in 1893. There were others in his class that were real scholars and leaders. Among them was J.P. Meyer, who was seminary professor for 44 years and taught seminary classes until he was 90. Pastor Brenner would have been the first to say that he wasn't a scholar in the sense that some of them were scholars, but he caught on early that we had to do work in English. And I first became interested in his work and his writing when I was doing my dissertation research and read his crisp, sharp editorials in the Northwestern Lutheran prior to 1933 when he became Synod President. You know, a lot of those guys that wrote back then, they wrote in what I would call translated German, which meant that these were long, complicated sentences. And you know how it is when you listen to a German speaker. There's the story about the crowd that sits in hushed anticipation, and then finally they break into applause because the speaker got to the main verb of the sentence. And a lot of those writers tended to think in German even as they wrote in English, but Brenner's English was sharp. And while professors like August Pieper and J.P. Kaler and John Meyer were shaping the thinking of the pastors, the lay people were reading Brenner. And Brenner and Hans Kohler Musa and a couple of others. And I became interested in how clearly he delineated synod positions. He both expressed them and helped to shape them. He had so many different positions. Maybe under the service to the church, the one that is of interest is the help that he gave to the Slovaks in Cudahy. He founded St. Paul's Church, which is still there. He served St. John's Church, which is called New Keln, and I think that church is sitting where a runway comes into the airport now. And that moved down Howell Avenue, and that's St. John's on Howell. And then the third church was this group of Slovaks who eventually became St. John's Missouri Synod Church in Cudahy. They're just off of Lake Drive. But he learned enough Slovak to be able to make calls on individuals, to do baptisms, and to do pastoral acts.
Lukáša. Kapitola 2. Narodenie Ježišovo. V tých dňoch vyšiel rozkaz od cisára Augusta popísať celý svet. Tento prvý popis bol vtedy, keď sýrskym vladárom bol Kyrénios. Išli preto všetci, aby sa dali zapísať, každý do svojho mesta, pretože nemali miesta v ubytovni.
I don't know how much he did Sunday services for them, because I think they had a man from Chicago who would come up and do church on the weekend. I'm not sure if he worked at a hospital. He was a pastor, a Slovak pastor. And later on, when the synods were in turmoil, the Slovak synod kind of lined up with Missouri, and the Norwegians lined up with Wisconsin. In fact, the most famous son of the Slovak church is Jaroslav Pelikan. And but the Slovaks, no matter how the politics were going, they had a great warmth for him, for what he had done there. Other than that, I think, as I say, most things explain themselves. The Northwestern Lutheran was founded in the study of the parsonage on Vliet Street on the second floor. And that was where the editorial meetings took place. And there was very much of a sense that the center of their universe was Milwaukee and the Milwaukee churches. And it's interesting to get that sense. Now, what I wanted to do today, I think you've always wanted to have sermons, but at least in the archives, there are not many of his sermons. So I don't know whether Professor Brenner, when he gets invited to preach, pulls into his grandfather's file and pulls out an old sermon. And, I mean, if he does and he makes some reference to President Roosevelt, I think we've caught him, you know, but maybe he didn't write out his sermons later on. I don't know. So we don't have many, and there aren't many that are published. But what I did get to read was his mail, his correspondence, from the time that he was a very busy Milwaukee pastor through the years when he was synod president. I don't know how much he ever had a regular secretary. His son was a secretary sometimes. It seems as though he typed a lot of his own letters, which surprises us until we realize that President Roosevelt also often typed his own letters in those days. And he seems to have had the same beat-up typewriter all the while because the W was always up off the line. But I picked out 5 letters that he wrote at various times, and they cover different subjects, and they give you a flavor for how he thought and how he presented himself. And this first one was to a pastor Schaller in Mankato, and he's writing about the infant Bethany College. He says, "In your work for Bethany College, you are not only serving the interest of those who will avail themselves of the opportunities this school offers to the student, but are also rendering the whole Lutheran Church an important service. In order to fulfill its glorious mission, our church must be strong to combat the destructive forces arrayed against it. Perhaps the most formidable of these is the indifference of our day. Give us practical Christianity, not doctrine, is the slogan of many. Unionism is in the air. Humanitarianism is threatening to supplant the religion of Christ. The community spirit is being assiduously fostered at the expense of loyalty to the church." That doesn't sound like a man for whom English was a second language, does it? "We dare not flatter ourselves that we are immune against these influences. Many who still bear our name, Lutheran, are very broad in matters of doctrine and practice. Such half-hearted Lutherans, far from proving faithful workers, exert an enervating influence on the whole congregation which they are found in numbers. Inertia may keep them with us for a while, but the slightest impulse will suffice to carry them into a church of some other denomination, or into that man-made substitute for the church, the lodge. Our church body today needs men and women who are sincere believers in Christ, who, fully convinced of the truth of our doctrines and the correctness of our principles, will make no compromise with or concession to error in any form, who, regarding all affairs of this life in the light of Scripture, have a clear view and a sound judgment, and who, filled with love toward their Savior, boldly confess him and gladly dedicate to his service the gifts he has bestowed on them. To train our children and young people in this spirit is the aim and object of every Lutheran school worthy of the name. This is therefore working directly and effectively for our common cause, the upbuilding and strengthening of our church. This fact is recognized among us, at least to a certain extent. Our congregations ask those also who have no children to contribute toward the support of the parochial school, and our synods establish and maintain colleges and seminaries for the common good. Our view should not be limited by parish and synod boundaries. A Lutheran of broad vision will readily understand that he has an interest in the training of those also who desire an education beyond that which the parochial school offers. He will not consider this entirely the private affair of their parents. It is an undeniable fact that the spiritual growth of a person must keep pace with his mental development if his Christianity is not to be endangered. Unreligious schools cannot serve our purpose. Institutions controlled by other denominations will not train Lutherans for us. Their influence will, in fact, tend to estrange our young people from their church. We must have Lutheran schools for our young Lutherans, and every Lutheran should give such schools his loyal and generous support. I think there are many leaders of our church that would simply say amen to that, about the importance of Lutheran schools. And some of the dangers that he talks about are the dangers that we're facing. By the way, I should probably sneak in a commercial. If you care about the history of Lutheran schools, and you would find this of interest, last Monday, a week ago Monday, was a symposium at the seminary on Lutheran schools. And they asked me to do the history paper. And the history paper is called What Our Fathers Taught Us About Lutheran Schools. If you get on the seminary website and look for symposium, you can download the paper. Or you can get on the college website and email me, and I'll send you a copy. I certainly learned things about our educational history I didn't know before. And people who've talked to me said they learned the same things. And if you sometimes wonder, why are we the way we are? I think one place to look is not just the education, but the formation that so many of us received in Lutheran schools. Okay. The second letter that I have here, and I think it's probably better to leave conversation till the end, if that's okay. The second letter President Brenner wrote after he became president of the Synod, and this was a letter he sent mimeographed to all the pastors of the Joint Synod because of the budget problem. This is dated September 20th, 1939. To the pastors of our Evangelical Lutheran Joint Synod of Wisconsin and other states, dear brethren, after paying out the $5,000 bonus, I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about, we had a balance of $35.41 in our synodical treasury. During July and August, the collections have been coming in rather slowly, but making use of other funds on hand, Treasurer Book was able to meet the requisitions at the beginning of the month of August. However, today, September 20th, we are $7,000 short, and 2 of our institutions are still waiting for their checks. The others and the missions have been sent theirs as the monies were received. This is a, bold letters, most deplorable state of affairs. Just let us put ourselves in the place of the men who have been waiting nearly 3 weeks for their meager enough checks to meet the obligations they have incurred. And let us remember Deuteronomy 24:15 and James 5:4. I forgot to look up James 5:4. I'm quite sure is the one that says, James says, you businessmen, the wages you fail to pay your workers are crying out to heaven against you. I have to look up Deuteronomy 24. I don't remember offhand. To relieve these brethren, at least before the month is over, it has been decided to get a short-term loan from a bank, which loan we hope to repay from the surplus of next month's income. And such a thing is, bold letters, entirely unnecessary. If we all had explained the conditions to our members when we were asked to do so, these Christian men and women would surely have provided sufficient funds to prevent an occurrence of this kind. In fact, we ought to have enough money on hand at the end of each month to send our schools during the very first days of send our checks during the very first days of the new month. There is no need for further words. These facts speak for themselves, and they do this so impressively that immediate and decisive action should result in every one of our congregations. Fraternally yours, John Brenner. Now, there are other stories about his way of managing this, helping to manage the Synod's funds and his own personal finances. Of course, he grew up at a very different time in our history, and for most of his life, what we regard as necessities were real luxuries to him, and I don't think he could even envision what we have today. But the stories that I hear, for one, was that he was instrumental in founding the Lutheran High School in 1903, and because he was involved in that, when the school had difficult financial times, he felt a personal obligation. And there are stories about him going to teachers' homes and giving them money until they would get paid so that they could pay their bills. The story at St. John's downtown was that, I'm not sure he ever had a checking account, the treasurer would come and bring him his cash, and he would take aside only as much as necessary and give all the rest back to the church. And there are those who would say that he was harsh in the things he said about the money. There are people who would say that this experience of having to get the Synod through the 1930s without going bankrupt forever affected him and the rest of his presidency, that he was slow to do mission work and slow to take on projects because he did not want to overspend the money available. I think he has to be understood in the context of when he lived. But President Schrader has read the stuff I've written about Brenner, and he finds great interest in it because I think he's thinking he's entering something of a similar situation in the finances of the church today. And There comes a time when you have to be strong. And one pastor, I think this man recently died, but of course he was a young man when President Brenner was president. He said he was absolutely the most courageous man I ever met. Not in a physical way, he wasn't a boxer or a ball player, but he says he had a backbone of steel. Professor Meyer would kind of tell him sometimes what to say, but he would not back down. And what looks like resolve to one person may be cruelty or harshness to somebody else, but he had, I guess, remarkable soft sides to him too that would come out surprisingly. The third letter here is to a letter that President Brenner wrote during World War II to Karl Kraus, who was a legendary pastor in Lansing and the president of the Michigan district. And they were discussing what might strike us as somewhat picky issues regarding how to practice church fellowship and about whether it's proper to hire organists from other backgrounds in order to play for church services. But I think he also shows quite a surprising amount of flexibility here. This is on January 10th, 1943. That's what's typed, and I think he must have meant 1944. You know how you do that at the beginning of a new year? You put the wrong date in a letter or something, because it makes more sense to be 1944. This is in the course of the letter. He says, "We are, I believe, agreed that only singers who are members of Synodical Conference churches may take part in our services as soloists, etc., though it is not always easy to get our members to see eye to eye with us on this question. I have had to withdraw from funerals and have lost members through insisting on this principle. But I am not ready to say that I would at all times take the same stand in the case of a non-Lutheran organist playing in a funeral home. Your question, it seems to me, is one of casuistry and must be decided by the responsible minister on the merits of the individual case. I can well imagine a case where it would be unionism pure and simple to have a non-Lutheran organist officiate on such an occasion on account of his person and background and his conception and that of the community of the part that he is assigned in the affair, public announcement, cards of thanks, etc. But in the instances of which I have knowledge, the organist, screened from the eye of the public and remaining entirely incognito, function merely as the causa movens externa, the external moving cause, that like the player role cut perhaps by an unbelieving organist sets the organ a-going, furnishing music while the audience is assembling and dispersing." So apparently, I always knew that there were player pianos, but apparently there were player organs at one time too. And you could put a roll in, and he's saying, well, you know, if you have a roll that's running the organ that was made in a factory somewhere, how do you know what church body the person is who made the roll that worked in the factory? He's sounding a little bit like a Jewish rabbi, I think, as he's making this, you know, these kind of careful distinctions here. We would say he's being rabbinic there. Is he actually taking part in our service, and are we fraternizing with him? Or does our service begin when the minister enters the room? I will say right here that there are things that we could not tolerate in connection with the funeral at which we are to officiate, even if they were done before our arrival. The ideal would be that everyone undertaking part in the burial of a Christian, including the undertaker and the sexton, be a brother in the faith. But this ideal is unattainable. An apodictical yes or no to your question would, to my mind, not clear the issue and might burden consciences unduly. A minister would, for instance, have to inquire diligently whether or not the Synodical Conference singer or organ that has been engaged serves for hire also at the non-Lutheran funerals or weddings. Questions like this one must, I hold, be answered by the responsible minister himself, conscientiously mindful that he must confess the truth and avoid giving offense. Now, this might seem like just so much, majoring in minors, but of course it was the doctrine of church fellowship and how it was practiced that led to the demise of the Synodical Conference. What struck me throughout Brenner's correspondence was that he repeatedly refused to try to solve issues that were somebody else's business. He would repeatedly say, that's a matter your district president should take care of, and that's a matter your pastor should take care of. And he says this here too. Situations like this are not black and white. Trust the judgment of the pastor involved and don't second guess him. When I was at seminary, I had Professor Lavrans, who had gone through all the intersynodical discussions too. And he said, if pastors agree on the principles involved in a difficult decision, then we should allow them the freedom of judgment to make their own decision and not second guess them. Now, maybe I'm only speaking a little bit out of my turn with my experience at the college, but of course, at the college, because we have a lot of non-Lutheran and even now some non-Christian students in our student body, it's not always clear what to do with each student in given situations. And I really wish that about 24 pastors, whose names I won't mention this morning, would take the same view that President Brenner had. Let us try to figure out what we should do with difficult situations. Instead of writing letters to us, 3 seminary professors and 5 district presidents, how they know better what we ought to do than what we're doing, because we have something of a spirit of, I'm going to tell you how you should run your ministry because I know better even though I'm living in Montana. And that's extremely frustrating, as you can probably tell. And of course, I'm reading his letters from the 1930s and 40s as I'm living in the 2000s, and I'm thinking he steadfastly refused to try to dictate to somebody else what to do when it was their decision. Even on some questions, he didn't necessarily agree on their conclusions. He wouldn't have done what they did, but he's the person in the position, and he should be responsible. So. The fourth letter, which is the longest, is also probably the most direct of all of these. This is a letter Pastor Brenner wrote in June of 1949 to Missouri President John Benken. And I don't know if there was a time when the two men were personal friends. The irony is that President Benken grew up on a farm in Texas, and yet he often gave the impression of being a rather smooth, urban, sophisticated kind of leader. And although President Brenner, lived all of his adult life in the city, he was sometimes regarded as being the less polished of the two. But by 1949, there were increasing signs that the Missouri Synod was changing its views on some things. There was a confusion of who spoke for the Synod, and there were decisions that certain people in Missouri made to go ahead with things, and then Wisconsin and the other Synodical Conference churches were kind of left holding the bag, like, how do we answer for this? And this is quite a direct letter. June 10th, 1949, to John W. Benken. If you had informed us of your plan, and he doesn't, there's a context where I don't know what the plan in particular was this time. But if you had informed us of your plan before proposing it to the presidents of Lutheran bodies, not in fellowship with the Synodical Conference, and giving it wide publicity, we would not again be finding ourselves in the unenviable position of facing an accomplished fact which leaves us no choice but that of either following you unquestioningly into a situation which we consider precarious, or of expressing our dissent by word and deed, and so bringing down on our synod anew the condemnation of the fervid advocates of a Lutheran church union. Let me stop there. I get the sense when President Brenner writes about this and he talks about things already being decided that we didn't get to speak about, I guess the best comparison I could make is when you have a marriage and one of the spouses agrees to all kinds of things with their children that the other spouse doesn't know about. And perhaps would agree if he or she knew about it in advance, or perhaps would rather have talked about it with the spouse before the kids were given the approval. And maybe you've experienced how frustrating that can be in a personal relationship. This is going on with 3 million Lutherans and the rest of the Lutheran world watching. But you have asked for our reaction, and I will try to state it briefly. The motivation offered in the preamble to the resolutions of your presidents, the Missouri Synod District presidents, and supported by remarks in your letter does not convince us that there is a compelling need of an all-out effort to bring all Lutheran bodies together, and that we are divinely called to support such a movement. In fact, we cannot escape the impression that there is in it at least a faint suggestion of planning for defense that goes beyond our duty of witnessing the truth single-mindedly as we are commissioned to do. As we declared in 1939, we are willing to meet for a discussion of doctrine and practice the representatives of any church body desiring such a conference. providing that it frankly admits that differences exist and insists that they must be removed before we can enter into fellowship with each other. Conflicting resolutions and public statements would naturally have to be written, or in the latter case, disavowed officially. A general free conference would therefore appear to be out of the question. We do not believe that the present conditions can be compared to those of the late 1850s. This is when they had when Missouri had free conferences and they were trying to see where all the different fledgling Lutheran synods were at doctrinally. The differences today have been set forth very clearly, and congregations have rallied around the banner of the synod that stands for their convictions, making themselves responsible for the doctrine and practice taught or tolerated in it. If they find something wrong within their household, their duty is, and this is Scripture, that of brotherly admonition. Negotiations between the synod should be carried on by representatives who are duly chosen for this work. I think the context of that is that there were certain individual pastors or professors from Missouri who would have discussions with the ALC, and they didn't officially represent their church body. Hence, we find local conferences, particularly when also laymen are to be invited, ill-advised. The men who attend on their own initiative represent their synod in fact, though perhaps not in theory, and I, for one, want to have a voice in the choice of the men who are to speak for me. The activities of self-appointed men do not unite the church, but will divide it eventually. They offer occasion for propaganda and for the formation of pressure groups that do not serve the interests of the truth. For the reasons stated above and for further reasons, we are not ready to consent to the creation of a national inter-Lutheran committee for the purpose of arranging and proposing free conferences of Lutheran pastors and laymen. And now, to be perfectly frank, for what are we going to stand of? What are we going to stand for if we should consent to attend the proposed free conferences? There was a time when the line of demarcation between the Synodical Conference and the other Lutheran bodies was so sharp and clear that it would not be necessary to ask this question. But it has been blurred and in instances almost obliterated by the statements and acts of individual men and of groups in your synod. Statements and actions against which we have been raising our voices all these years, and we have not been able to remove even one of the issues that have arisen between us. Shall we discuss them in the presence of men from other Lutheran bodies? It is an open secret that there is a sharp division in your synod. Conservatives and progressives are voicing their convictions publicly, and the latter are by their actions encouraging movements which we consider detrimental and dangerous to the church. Can we, under these conditions, have the courage to believe that we are called and in a position to correct and direct other Lutheran bodies? We are of the firm conviction that it is our first duty, and this is a holy duty, to set our own house in order, and that in doing this in the true spirit of the gospel, we are making the most effective contribution toward the unity of the Lutheran Church in our land and in other countries. But we want to hear you before we make a final decision. The Committee on Intersynodical Relations has been created by the Synodical Conference for this very purpose, and it is more readily available than any other group would be. But I will be glad to consider any suggestion which you may wish to make. That is a very direct letter. And I don't know that synodical leaders talk to each other like that anymore. There is a story that both President Brenner's son and grandson told about a time after both synod presidents were retired. And President Brenner, in retirement, lived in Bay City with his son, and I'm not sure what brought President or former President Benkin to Michigan. He had one of his district president buddies was in the Saginaw area, maybe he was there, and he called Pastor Brenner on the phone to ask for a friendly visit, and Brenner refused. And he just believed that, and he said to him at that last point, these problems between our synods have been caused because you did not attend to your business. And, I wonder if I'm going to get a little nicer right before I die, but I guess he felt he had to speak the harsh truth, even though it was hard right to the end. I've read a letter that Benkin wrote to one of his, to somebody in 1955, where he said, I honestly do not believe our synod is changing. And it is difficult to understand how he could have maintained that view, unless he really was not paying attention or just didn't want to look at certain things that were going on in Missouri. And of course, these kept fermenting until 1974 when they burst open at Concordia Seminary. So it's difficult sometimes to put to provide the context for some of the things, because this is a back and forth correspondence. But he said his piece. The last letter is short, and it was written after he declined to be Synod President. He chose not to run or to serve anymore following the 1953 convention. And then Oscar Naumann became the Synod President. And when you simply look at letters, you see the difference, because as I said, Pastor Brenner typed out his letters by himself on this beat-up typewriter, and there were strikeouts and crosses. And then President Naumann's letters were far lengthier, perfect typing, notations of a secretary at the bottom as somebody else typed it. And some people thought that Pastor Naumann was a little bit softer than Pastor Brenner. I think there are some people who ended up being in the Church of the Lutheran Confession and left the Wisconsin Synod because they felt that Naumann did not carry on with the same vision, if you will, that President Brenner did. You know that in 1955, the Wisconsin Synod in convention resolved that they recognized the Missouri Synod as a persistently erring church body, but they also resolved not to break fellowship with Missouri until Missouri had a chance to meet in 1956. Then in 1956 they met, and Wisconsin saw some things Missouri did as evidences that they were perhaps going to return to some older practices. By 1957, Wisconsin was not so reassured, and the floor committee on the Synod Convention in New Ulm recommended that Wisconsin break with Missouri, and the vote failed by 16 votes. And following that, between 1957 and 1960, about 60 pastors of the Wisconsin Synod left to form the Church of the Lutheran Confession. And I've gotten some mail from a couple of those people who personally felt that Naumann and his softer approach, as he saw it, was responsible. And had Brenner or somebody like him still been president, perhaps that wouldn't have gone that way. I talked to a couple of men who knew the particular pastor who thought that, and they said, I wouldn't trust his judgment on a lot of things. So I don't know if that's felt widely. But one of the men, who was who was a great supporter of Brenner, wrote to him in 1954 after Pastor Naumann is president, and basically saying, I'm not so sure that maybe Naumann is the right guy. And this is the letter that President Brenner wrote back to him. This is to the pastor Gaversius W. Fisher in Mankato, February 12, 1954. Dear Pastor Fisher, thank you for permitting me to read your letter to President Naumann, which he was, I think, telling him what he should be doing. As I have only one side of your local matter, I cannot form an opinion, much less express one. But I have received a number of his letters to President Benken, and I'm convinced that he's holding his own in this controversy. Surely there will be a difference in his conduct of affairs, as there is a difference between our characters. It is up to the members of our synod to correct anything of which they do not approve. As President Naumann is in the service of the entire synod, he could not avoid meeting with the president of the Missouri Synod. While I do not agree with the resolutions of the synod that were adopted, I am not ready to refuse to make every effort to explain our position to the Missourians. If I were in your place, I would not take your position. Least of all should you permit your members to withdraw their support from our synod. Our duty is to keep each other straight through brotherly admonition, and this duty devolves upon your members in Mankato. And while they are admonishing, they should continue to support our institutions and missions. We have not reached the stage when all admonition is in vain. Sincerely yours. I can't help feeling, as I read all of his letters, and I did this for portions of 3 summers, and I would say that the most fun I have in life is with my wife when we get to do things together. And I certainly still enjoy being a professor at the college, and I guess I hope to do that till they have to wheel me out. But the best fun I can have alone is reading other people's mail. And you do have the occasional feeling of being a little bit of a voyeur as you go through their mail. But to sit in the seminary lower level and have the archives brought out and read these letters and try to recreate is a fascinating thing. Primary sources is where the interesting history is at. And as I would read his letters over the course of 3 summers, I was reminded of that verse in Proverbs that says, iron sharpens iron. That he was not afraid to give or to receive clear brotherly admonition. And you know, we live in an age when so many people's self-esteem is so fragile, and they're worried about being told that they're the best and they're wonderful, and we have races where kids can't even be declared winners because they all have to get a prize. And we think, what a far cry it was from the age when President Brenner was president of the synod and pastor. And there's a kind of a tough male love in his letters. Even some of the letters, I didn't read any of them to you, but some of the ones that he wrote to pastors during the Depression who didn't get a call. And they really whined to him sometimes. And, you know, he encouraged them and he supported them, but he was a man. In fact, that was the line that one of the pastors said about him. He was a man and a Christian. Not a Christian man. And I think there's a reason that he used that unusual phrase. There was a different kind of masculinity then that was expected and that he gave them. So one man told me the same man who told me that he was tough as nails and strong, he said, you know, he wouldn't make it in the ministry today. I thought that was an interesting comment because today it's a different sort of culture that we work in. So those are my letters, and I'd be glad to entertain any questions that you have. Yes? Yes, the question is, how did he accept criticism? It's a little difficult to tell that from his letters. I've talked to his grandson, and I think his grandson is relatively balanced about his grandfather. I mean, I think whenever you've got the same name as someone who is important, you have a certain obligation. I think you had to have your ducks lined up and you had to say why you were saying something. But I think if you did that, he also would take it in the spirit that it was given if you came to him and said it directly. You had to talk to him. There is an exchange of letters between him and Kowalski. Kowalski was president of Northwestern, and they were longtime friends. And there you get a sense that how they would talk to each other. I think it's also fair to say that he and Kowalski and probably several other people in the Synod practiced heavily what some people have called the Northwestern brand of humor, which is a very male, somewhat sarcastic sense of humor among each other. And most of us, I don't know if this is true anymore, I don't know if this is true at New Ulm, but this certainly was true of us as we went through Northwestern in the 40s, 50s, 60s, that you had to learn to practice to give and take that kind of talk. And most of us have been spending the rest of our lives trying to get over it. And our wives have helped us to re-enter into polite society and say, you just can't talk quite that way with people. But we still, when I was at seminary last Monday and saw a few of my old friends, it's like riding a bike. You never forget how to do it. But it's not real useful, but that was just the tone. And I think if you read early 20th century literature, read H.L. Mencken, and you'll get a flavor for what that was like, and that was part of our synodical talk too. So I think it had to go both ways, but he would respect you for it, is my sense. Yes?
I really think I have to say something because I know Astronomical quite well. And I was at New Ulm for geometry in high school. And then later, let's see. So it was the time just when all of this was beginning to happen. We were very aware at New Ulm about detention and everything. But when you say Pastor Norman was soft, he wasn't.
That's right.
He was not soft. And I can even see him getting angry enough to see the blood vessels in his temples. I mean, he was a fine, sturdy. He was a man for sure and strong. They're wonderful. And I just went there, and then he was around so that I would meet him at the seminary somehow.
Yes.
He was a close relative of Carl Gergel, the old Carl Gergel, and he too was in mine. I too was very, very well acquainted with him.
Yeah.
So I just would like to tell you some of the things I remember sometime.
Well, thank you. Pastor Nauman, now he must have tutored at New Ulm before he took his call to...
Professor Nauman was a professor.
He was a professor, okay.
And he was a professor, and he taught geometry, and I had him for at least, I remember playing geometry I had him for, and I think, he also taught higher algebra or whatever.
And then he was a pastor in St. Paul, Minnesota, right? And he was pastor there, and then I believe he was district president for a short time. And then when he became synod president in 1953, he was still pastor there for a while, as Pastor Brenner was still pastor at St. John's, until about 1959 or so, and then it became a full-time position. And then President Nauman was a member at Mount Lebanon, and that's where I grew up. So I knew him a little bit by sight, and I knew all of his sons. They would all sit in descending order in a particular pew every Sunday. Paul, the youngest, was a classmate of mine through school, and one vacation when I was in prep, I was hitchhiking home, as we often did in those days, and President Nauman picked me up. He was driving by, and so he talked to me like I was a colleague instead of a tertianer all the way there. And then I would see him occasionally at various things. The Sun Choir sang for the funeral of his wife, and we were there, and as I recall. And he would come to seminary, of course, for Call Day, and he would address us every year at Call Day. And I always remember him standing and looking at us and saying, "You are God's gifts to the church." And most people who think that they're God's gifts to the church cause a lot of trouble. But he meant that in the context of Ephesians 4, where it says that Christ gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be pastors and teachers. And there wasn't a one of us that ever heard him say that with any sense of pride or arrogance, but great humility. I think the irony is that Brenner was a person who appeared to be tough, but had a soft side. And Pastor Nauman may have been a person who appeared to be softer, but was just as strong. He may have exhibited his patience in a different way. But, and I think that was the point of former President Brenner's letter. There really isn't a difference here. And you owe him, as you owed me and owed the Synod, your loyalty, even if things... And of course, he's talking in Mankato. Mankato was one of the centers of where there was disagreement with the Synod about Missouri. So that was kind of in the hot seat there. But thank you for that recollection. Anything else? Well, if you want to read more about President Brenner, probably many of you know this already, but the WELS Historical Institute Journal has the full article. It's a two-volume article that I wrote about his life, which includes a lot of excerpts from his letters as well as his writing.
Perhaps his longtime friend John P. Meyer offered the most thoughtful evaluation of his classmate and lifelong co-worker. He said, whether Brenner was aware of it or not, he always acted according to the principle which he, together with his classmates, had adopted as their class motto in 1893, Latin, of course, Praesens imperfectum, futurum perfectum. The present is imperfect, but the future perfect. We must remember that the present is always burdened with imperfections. Perfection is an ideal for which we must strive untiringly, but the attaining of which has been reserved for the future. In the words of Luther, as long as we are on earth, there is not a Wesen but a Werden, not a being, but a becoming. Brenner was firm, but he would not force an issue as long as there was hope for improvement. John Brenner provoked strong feelings. People either really liked him or they really didn't. His supporters remained convinced that he came to office at a time when the synod needed a man of his nature and ability. Those who worked with him recognized him as a real leader. Said one, "I felt and still feel that President Brenner led the synod, whereas the presidents we have had since then have represented the synod." Said another, "Brenner was one of the great gifts of God to our church, a man who was absolutely the right man for that job at that time. But, if you understand me right," he said, "a man who would never make it in the ministry today. It's a different time. He would never back down. He was a man's man."
Okay, thank you.